Lavos, the alchemist frame, is the newest frame added to Warframe with the Operation Orphix Venom. Currently he is available only on PC, he will be coming to consoles sometime in January. This video is divided into 3 parts in which I will explain, to the best of my ability, how Lavos' abilities work, how to build Lavos and how he performs in various missions. Lavos can be acquired through Operation Orphix Venom. The blueprints drop in the missions, but can also be bought from Father for phase excels. Lavos will be available after the event is over in some way that hasn't been decided yet. Lavos is unique because instead of using energy, his abilities have cooldowns. This makes him a great choice for missions where energy is restricted, like Nightmare and Sortie missions with energy drain or reduction, and endurance runs where parasitic eximuses and energy leeches might become a problem. I don't think the cooldowns are too much of a hassle, you just need to get into another frame of mind while playing Lavos. And I had a lot of fun playing Lavos in the Index, though I would still go to pick up the energy orbs out of habit. Lavos' passive ability grants him status immunity for 10 seconds after picking up energy and universal orbs. It works well with his high armor and health stats and makes Lavos a very tanky frame. The second part of his passive gives him the ability to combine and imbue his next ability cast with elemental damage. The original elemental damage of the ability will remain and the elemental damage is added. So if you hold 1 and then tap 1 to cast it, the damage will still be toxin, but it will be doubled. And if you hold 4 and then use your 1, you will deal both toxin and heat damage. You can also combine elements if you imbue 2 in succession, so you can get viral if you hold 1 and then 2. You can also hold 2 numbers at the same time to combine them. The elements and the currently imbued element are displayed in the lower right corner. It's important to note here that you lose the ability to imbue the element if you replace the ability with a Helminth ability. I think that Lavos works well with his existing kit, so I don't see any need to replace one of his abilities. And I think that nothing can be gained without first sacrificing something of equal value, so if you do want to use a Helminth ability, choose wisely. The mixing of elements is a bit awkward to use in missions. The hold to imbue mechanic takes a bit of time and needs to be done before every cast for optimal damage. You could swap the tap and hold in the menus to imbue faster, but that makes Lavos' abilities a bit more difficult to use. People have made good suggestions on how to improve this, but I think it just takes a bit of getting used to. To play Lavos most effectively, one needs to use the enemy's elemental weaknesses. While I would like to cover elemental damage and status effects and what fractions to use them on, I don't want this video to be half an hour long. So I might make a separate video on this. Lavos' first ability is the Ophidian Bite. Lavos strikes with his 2 serpents dealing toxin damage and healing himself. It has an 8-second cooldown. The damage and healing scales with ability strength and range with ability range. The issue with this ability is that the damage isn't really relevant at higher levels. The suggestions to improve this are to either have it benefit from melee stat sticks, like Korra's Whipclaw or similar abilities, or have the damage increase with each status effect applied, like his Catalyze ability. Lavos' second ability is the Vial Rush. I appreciate the fact that Lavos somehow has both heals and wheelies. He uses them to dash and leave a trail of broken vials that deal cold damage. You can tap the ability again to stop and throw out your remaining vials in a half circle. This is harder to control if you're using the swapped hold tap controls, but you can also jump instead of holding the ability again. The cooldown on this ability is 5 seconds, which is the shortest cooldown. The ability range will affect how far you can go and the number of charges you can drop. Strength affects the damage and damage per second of the trail you leave behind, and ability duration affects the duration of the trail. The explosion radius applies only to the final explosion, but it doesn't affect the explosion radius of the charges. I find this a bit annoying, since this would otherwise be Lavos' best damage dealing ability at lower levels. It's still not terrible, but you can dash through a corridor full of enemies, and only manage to kill a third of them because the area coverage is low. The charges also fall a bit slow. I thought they would drop faster. Another big issue with this ability is that you can't steer while you dash. More often than not, I have found myself running into walls or other obstacles that could have been easily avoided. This is also the ability you get once you subsume Lavos to the helmet. I don't have an extra Lavos to sacrifice yet, but I would like to see how this ability works on Gauss. Lavos' third ability is the Transmutation probe that he launches to shock enemies, even through floors and walls. Each enemy hit by the probe reduces the cooldown on other abilities by 1 second. The probe will also convert health and energy orbs into universal orbs and ammo pickups into universal ammo. The probe can be stopped by activating the ability again before it runs out. The scaling on this ability is pretty straightforward. The damage per tick is affected by ability strength and range by ability range. Efficiency will affect the cooldown reduction per enemy hit. I thought I would be able to speed up the probe by reducing ability duration and increasing the range, but it doesn't work like that. The probe has a default duration of 3 seconds that can't be changed. And natural talent only speeds up the casting animation, but not the travel speed. Catalyze is Lavos' fourth ability. Lavos launches 9 probes that spread out and go through walls and obstacles, damaging enemies both above and below. The vertical range was a lot more narrow at first, which made it very frustrating to use. This feels a lot better now, but it's still possible to miss enemies if you stand on higher ground. As far as I can tell, the vertical height is around 2 meters above and below the probes. Catalyze deals innate heat damage and sets the enemies on fire. The probes have a default duration of 5 seconds, that can't be changed, and the ability range will increase how far they travel, so the probes will travel faster with more range. I think it's important to explain exactly how this ability's damage scales, because I've seen some wrong explanations. The base damage scales with ability strength. In addition, the ability description says that the damage is doubled for every different status effect that the target suffers from. Based on this, you might conclude that the ability works like condition overload, and adds 100% damage for every status proc, but that would be wrong. Condition overload increases by 120% for every status proc, making its damage progression linear. Catalyze doubles with each status proc, which means its progression is exponential. If we're looking only at 2 or 3 status effects, the difference isn't too noticeable. But at 7 or 8 or more status effects, the difference is quite significant. Just to prove that I'm right, let's look at the damage numbers. The base damage of the Catalyze on these corrupted heavy gunners is 219. With 1 status effect afflicting the target, Catalyze deals 439 damage. With 2 status effects, it deals 878 damage. With 3 status effects, it deals 1756 damage. And with 4 status effects it deals 3512 damage. As you can see, the damage increases exponentially. Remember that this damage also increases if you use the elemental weakness of the enemies you're fighting, and this damage is added to the base heat damage. The damage over time from the heat status effect scales in the same way. So you might think that the best way to use Lavos at higher levels is to use his other abilities to proc status effects, and then use Catalyze to finish them off. But I find it a bit awkward, since you also need to think about status durations, cooldowns, and usually can't capture that many enemies in your ability range. So I have been using the alternate fire of the Cedo, in addition to the abilities, to prime enemies for Catalyze. That way is more effective for me, though it depends on the enemies getting hit by the elemental glaive. If you decide to use the Cedo this way, you might want to pick up a ribbon that increases status duration. While you can use Lavos' abilities as a way to prime enemies with status effects for your melee weapons with condition overload, I think it's a waste of potential. There is no reason why you couldn't do that while you wait on the cooldown from Catalyze. But I want you to be aware of how much potential Catalyze has, so that you don't think it's a worse version of Saren's miasma. Before we take a look at my builds, let's summarize how Lavos' abilities scale. Duration affects the duration of the trail left over by Vial Rush and status duration of all your abilities. The base status duration is 6 seconds on all abilities. Range increases the range of your abilities, most importantly the range of the Transmutation probe and Catalyze. Strength will increase your base elemental damage and the health drain of Ophidian Bite. Efficiency will only increase the cooldown reduction of the Transmutation probe. Since the efficiency of the cooldown reduction depends more on the range of the probe and how well you aim it, you don't need to worry about it. Now, let's take a look at some builds. Lavos has an innate D and an innate dash polarity, and I put 2 formas on him. I tend to use the lowest amount of formas on my frames that I can make work, since it gives me more flexibility with my builds. If you're using Lavos in lower levels, and by that I mean any mission that is not the steel path, you can deal significant damage to enemies just using your abilities, without worrying about stacking status effects. Just remember to use elements that match the enemy's weaknesses. So my first build focuses only on strength and range. I also usually build my frames to be more tanky. Feel free to replace adaptation with overextended, if you don't mind the loss of strength. You could also replace umbral fiber with whatever you see fit. In most lower level missions you won't need this much survivability. You can use whichever arcanes you like, just don't use arcane energize. I have arcane guardian and grace since I was testing this build in the steel path. You could make the strength build work on the steel path, but I'd recommend going with more ability duration. While strength increases the base damage of your abilities, they won't do much damage to steel path enemies. You will have to rely on Catalyze, which scales more significantly with the number of different status procs inflicted onto the enemies. So more range and duration will work better than more strength. With this build, you will need to focus on spreading status procs with both your abilities and your weapons. The Cedo is the best primary for this purpose. Out of your abilities, try to rely on your 1 and 2 to spread statuses, and only use your 3 to lower Catalyze's cooldown. And my third build utilizes the Mecha Set, because of its set bonus. Killing an enemy marked by your companion transfers all their status effects on enemies around them. This can actually work well with only the Cedo, but serves extremely well for setting up your Catalyze. The only issue with this build is that it relies on a Kubro companion, and they can be hard to keep alive in higher level missions. Out of all the Kubros I've tested, my Medjai Predacite has been doing the best job of staying alive. Even in the steel path, they managed to stay alive more than I expected. As long as you can dispose of the enemies in a timely manner, your companion should manage to stay alive. In case they don't, you can run Bazaar Focus so you can revive them faster. Now that we've covered builds, let's look at how Lavos performs in various missions. In general, Lavos has high survivability with his high health and armor, and his first ability that can heal him. He can also do a lot of damage, although it takes him a bit longer to set it up than other frames. He can adapt his damage to exploit his enemies' weaknesses. Perhaps his greatest disadvantage is the lack of crowd control. The only way Lavos can protect a defense target is by killing any enemies that come near it. Another disadvantage is that he deals damage slower than other frames since he relies on status effects and has to wait on his cooldowns. This might become frustrating if you have very aggressive and efficient teammates. He is also not much of a support frame. The only thing he can do for his teammates is generate universal ammo and orbs, and spread status effects. Lavos is not good in missions with a defense target since he has no way of protecting it from weapons fire and no way to heal it. And the damage he can deal with his abilities can be too slow to efficiently protect the target. If you're not playing alone, this might not be too much of a problem. Lavos is not especially good at spy missions, but you can use him if you really want to. Lavos is well suited for missions where energy is restricted, the Index, sorties with energy reduction and nightmare missions with energy drain. Since Lavos doesn't rely on energy, he will be able to use his abilities as usual. But you should stay out of Sanctuary and Elite Sanctuary Onslaught. Lavos can't keep up with Saren, Volt or Mirage, and doesn't do much to support them. He can do fairly well alone, but the efficiency becomes hard to keep up with his cooldowns. Lavos does well in arbitrations, he just needs to deal with the arbitration drones using his weapons. Defense and excavation arbitrations will be harder, so he should team up with frames that can either protect or heal the defense target or excavator. Lavos can do Kuva Lich or Murmur missions easily. He is also well suited for them since we can change his damage to match the weakness of the Kuva Lich. Lavos is well suited for the steel path, mostly for exterminate, sabotage and long survival missions. As I mentioned before, any mission with a defense target can be problematic for Lavos, especially if you're playing solo. Missions against infested won't be that hard, but enemies that can shoot the defense target will be a problem. In general, Lavos has trouble dealing with any target that is immune to status effects, such as the sentience. In the end, I can't decide how I feel about Lavos. I was very frustrated with him at first, but he has grown on me. I still think there are minor tweaks that could be done, but I have gotten used to this playstyle, so I hope Lavos won't change too much. He is definitely a frame that needs a bit of time to get used to, but once you do, he can be very powerful. Due to his complexity and the skill required to play, I wouldn't recommend him to newer players. Or if you think that all the status effects might cause your graphics card to explode. He also does a lot better in higher level missions, where faster frames aren't able to deal as much damage. I think he's also a good solo frame. If you're bored of the simpler frames, I definitely think you should take the time to master Lavos. And while the setup takes a bit of skill and time, pulling off a good Catalyze throw can be very satisfying.